Well, welcome everybody. And today's presentation will be recorded. Good afternoon. And this is going to be a very special webinar that we're going to be happy to present. It's called Understanding Moral Injury and the Impact of Behavioral Health Work with Families. I'm Gail Cormier, the Project Director of NASDAQ, the Family Center of Excellence. Understanding the impact of moral injury is pivotal to the mental health workforce in learning resilience and self-care strategies and best practices when working with families who trust you to support them in the best possible manner. This webinar will provide insight into navigating moral injury and increase awareness of more effective tools to support and advocate for families. Before we get started on our presentation today, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording, along with the PowerPoint presentation slides and any additional resources, will be uploaded on our events page after the presentation. All attendees will be muted for the presentation portion of today's webinar. However, we still look forward to hearing your questions, and we are happy to help you with any technical issues you may have. To ask a question or request technical assistance, please send a message in the chat box. We'll be watching the chat during the entire presentation. If time allows, we will unmute and you will have an opportunity to ask questions. If you could use your raise your hand button, that would be greatly appreciated. When you leave this webinar, you'll be redirected to complete a short feedback survey using the link provided. This survey will help us continuously improve our webinars, and it also fulfills our SAMHSA funding obligation to provide them with important data required by our contract. Please note, all information will be confidential, and we will respect your privacy. We do not offer CEU credits for our webinars, but you will receive a certificate of attendance immediately after you fill out the survey. Once you leave on your own from Zoom, you'll be taken to a survey to be filled out. When you finish that survey, you will be then taken to an area where you can download your certificate of participation and attendance and put your own name in it. I would like to thank SAMHSA for allowing us to share this information with you today. And again, thank you for joining us. It is now my honor to turn this webinar over to Dr. Tamika Damon and Willow Burgess. They will introduce themselves at the beginning of their presentation. And remember, NASDAQ always uses family-driven language. We are trauma responsive, strengths-based, avoid blaming caregivers, inclusive. We use person-centered language. We are respectful, non-judgmental, and consistent with our actions. Thank you. Dr. Damon?
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I am absolutely honored to be a part of this webinar, to be able to offer what I can contribute in my education and experience, and be able to just share with you this incredibly important topic. I did hear there is quite a few people that are in the audience, and to me, that's evidence of that you find this topic to be important as well. So I know there's going to be a little poll that's going to ask sort of who are the people in the room. I wanted to first tell you a little bit about me, and then I definitely wanted to know a bit about you. So as she mentioned, I am Dr. Tamika Damon. I am a clinical psychologist that's licensed in California. I have a private practice downtown Los Angeles, and we have beautiful weather today. I do specialize in culturally sensitive services that are strength-based, and my emphasis of services are empowerment, personal growth, and healing. I am certified. I have certified training in compassion fatigue, which leads me to have this expertise in this topic. And I would love to know about all of you. So I know there's several different types of people in the room in terms of your relation to the organization, and if it's possible to put up the poll, then we can kind of get a survey all together of who's in our virtual space. Oh, it's going. Nice. Now, some of the listing that we have on here, family peer support specialists, supportive family members, individuals, people who come for their own personal interests, peer recovery support, administrators, of course, and clinicians, and any other mental health professionals that may be missed in the titles. Nice. Nice. This survey gives us a sense, and obviously all of you as well, as you enter virtual spaces, sometimes it's hard to really get a full picture collectively of how we're all coming together. So it looks like family peer support specialist, it's representing, absolutely. Okay, good. You can let me know when
Dr. Deming,
Mhm.
I see that we folks answered question number 2 and number 3 too. If you scroll down, you could get some answers for that too.
Oh, I just saw that. Oh, okay, cool. And then we're going to come back to that as we get into some of the later parts. But that's excellent. You all are advanced students. I love it. All right, I'm going to make sure that I put this over here on my screen to come back to it. Okay, let's see. All right, let's jump into the good stuff. So, as I said, your presence here is, a shared commitment to fostering the understanding, support, and collaboration in this field as we all have together. And these are important topics. And what I want to do is make sure that as we go through the definition of the topic and some examples, that we definitely get to some of the resilience pieces and the piece that more than likely you came in to want to go home with, which is what to do once you get back in your communities, even with yourself, once you get this information. So for the topic, we're gonna go through, and then yes, perfect. Oh, you're good in terms of advancing the slides. Thank you. So we're going to go over what is it? What is moral injury? What is it all about? How is it defined? We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the topic and why it's important. We're going to talk about the signs, particularly the risk factors that's associated, that's common to this, and the professional consequences that come with this experience. We're also going to talk about what would help. How are the ways that we can protect ourselves, protect our peers, and protect our community? And so that is going to be overall offering some insight into navigating moral injury as a whole. All right, let's go. We're going to stay on this slide. All right, so yeah, there we go. Thank you. So moral injury, the term itself, is relatively new in the whole picture of all of the psychological terms. It was first developed by psychiatrist Jonathan Shea over 20 years ago while working with Vietnam veterans. And oftentimes, if you've heard about the topic, you've typically heard about it in relation to the military. It's defined as I'm going to read it, right? The moral injury occurs when we perpetrate, bear witness to, or fail to present an act that transgresses our deeply held moral beliefs. Now, this was a definition that Wendy Dean came up with. There are several definitions that exist out there, some more long-winded, some with a lot more details, but I like this one in particular because it really got to the core of what the topic is about. But what you'll notice is that as the definitions come about, they all really center on The one particular piece that's important that distinguishes it from some of the other terminology associated with moral injury, such as burnout and PTSD, which is that it's significant, that it is profound, that it is strong feelings of moral distress that happens inside. And I think that that is going to be one of the indicators as we go on that I'm going to make some distinctions. All right, so in this definition, everyone has a set of moral values. And for each of us, there are some that are more important than others. There's some that we adhere to more in terms of how our character gets defined in our childhood, in our professional experiences, and our life experiences that we feel just more aligned with. And you'll notice that the instances of moral injury may come up, individual for each person that is more than likely aligned with that personal value that you particularly have. There's a safe assumption that everyone in the room care about other human beings. You're more than likely all very compassionate people. To get to where you are and whatever circumstances that you have, you're more than likely have made sacrifices in your life experience. And when these life events are not in alignment, those sometimes lead to the vulnerability that has a possibility of moral injury. So as all of these definitions have been listed, the research is relatively recent. I know 20 years seems like a long time, but in all of the history of research of psychological terms, it really is fairly new. And particularly when a term gets coined, by the time it gets to the public, by the time it hits research, by the time it gets out into the field in treatment of that sort, where it hits the people, what you'll notice is that sometimes the research takes a little while to begin to really distinguish between different concepts. And what we know so far is that it's not a mental illness, it's not a diagnosis. Moral injury is a syndrome, is something that we notice that happens. We notice how it affects people, and how great there's more people coming to the room. Welcome to all the new people that came. We're just jumping into the topic. So as we get into it, there's some terms that are fairly similar, which depending on where you're reading the literature, you might see them being used interchangeably. And so I do want to make note of them. As the research gets more sophisticated, you'll notice that these terms become more distinguished, but you'll see that kind of go in and out. So I just sort of want to give you some preview to that. So sometimes if you look at burnout, or you look at the diagnosis of PTSD, or even trauma-related concepts, where when that happens, it can happen both moral injury, burnout, and PTSD. They will have symptoms that mirror all three, but they do have fine distinctions. And as I've noted earlier, the most fine distinction that I want you to go home with is that idea that when it is moral injury, that it's the depth of the inner conflict. It's the existential questioning that happens. It's the emotional disturbance that's experienced. And more than likely, it rocks your world. If you've ever heard that term before, it really gets a fundamental shift into your worldview or identity. And it's usually linked to a specific event, like something happened. And when that something happened, it shook you at the core. It sometimes will bring up tremendous amounts of guilt and shame. And it really challenges you at that level where it's beyond just workplace burnout, when you're frustrated, or when there's something that happens continually. It gets to a point where it's something that you take home and really start having to organize your inner self. And so when that happens, it's a high level of degree of alertness, and that piece, let me start this, where we really have to start looking at it wholly as both an organization, as a community. This is something that happens on a global level, actually. And just to give like a this may not be your experience as the crowd that we have here, but I think that in understanding moral injury, it is important to give an example that is emotionally charged. So I apologize for the example, but it is one of the more commonly used examples that explore and define what it is. And that is of the combat soldiers, because remember, it first sort of started in military literature and research, where let's say if someone was to take a life, even if the experience was in some way, this is hard to say, like justified, let's say if it was self-defense, let's say if it was to save another life, the person who did commit that act has to still go home and sit with themselves. And when they do, the likelihood that that is against their moral values, that is against something that they will ever do, not in that situation, that's going to have a discrepancy within themselves and how they believe and how they act, as well as how they act in that situation. And that is a recipe for moral injury. You've seen it more than likely talked about in the pandemic. When it happened, there was a lot of talk about mental health and like nurses and doctors who had to make decisions about who to give life-saving service to. And that was, hard situations. People were talking about that a lot. And so those are sort of those situations that are more commonly talked about. And with this presentation, I really wanted to focus on how this may look at a different degree and with different examples in the populations that we are all together collectively, which is why I thought it was important to do that first poll and say who's in the room, because this shows up in mental health. This shows up in service-based or home-based services. It shows up in a lot of different places. Actually, it's almost surprising when you think about how it can come about and how it can affect the people. That is, I'm thinking journalists, people who are veterinarians, sometimes even service people that are like emergency first responders, people who are in the legal profession, in the media, chaplains, it affects us in all different ways. But I wanted to focus on how it affects us as a group here. So I think if we're talking about moral injury, it's going to be important to talk about what is moral values, right? What is it that is getting triggered? What is it that having a profound sense of distress? What is it that getting targeted? And I'm going to sort of rattle off some of the values that may be at play. And what I want you to do is you hear all of them, because it's verbal. And so I want you to just hang on to the one that resonates with you. Sort of pick out the one that hits your ears in a sort of way that you can connect with. And if any of you have, it's not required that you take notes, but if any of you have a piece of paper or even just have the memory in your head, lock on to that one. And as we go through the examples in later parts of the presentation, that's the one I want you to internally, as you think about these topics or these concepts, hang on to that particular one. So first is compassion, right? Now, I mentioned earlier that more than likely, because of the type of population we are, that all of you have some sense of compassion, that when you witness suffering, when you're feeling unable to alleviate it, that might lead to a sense of compassion fatigue. And then that's going to affect your empathetic nature, that can sometimes compromise how you emotionally connect with clients. And so if you have the value of someone that is a compassionate person, if this thing gets triggered in some way where you're not able to offer compassionate services, again, these are just some examples of what may lead to moral injury. All right, so now we have integrity. Let's see how this one, who feels aligned with this one. So this is when you may feel conflicted between professional ethics and organizational constraints. And sometimes as you are within the mental health profession, that sense of integrity can lead you to have compromises and self-doubt. So integrity, and one of the examples is going to be using integrity as we go forward. Another one is autonomy. For autonomy, if we're unable to advocate effectively for families, again, due to systematic barriers, due to organizational policies, that can also undermine our sense of autonomy, often leading to feelings of powerlessness and frustration. So being able to independently, have a sense of what is the right thing to do and to move forward to do that. Sometimes there's some hiccups in being able to do that. So that can also be something. Next, we have empathy. So if you have exposure to a family member or someone that has a traumatic experience, well, without adequate support or resources, that can desensitize you to the other person's pain. It could lower your capacity for empathy and understanding. And in the example that I mentioned earlier with the nurses and the doctors, I imagine that some of that was happening where to be able to be in that fast pace, to be able to make those decisions, you have to remove yourself in a bit of your empathetic, very natural nature to, get the job done, if you will. And so that is, again, one of the ways. All right, we have justice. So if you are witnessing inequalities in the access of mental health service, if you are seeing how resources are not allocated in the way that needs to be to service the community that is right in front of you, if you personally have a commitment to justice and fairness, all of these can lead to very strong feelings of being morally outraged, of being disillusioned. And when you think about inequalities, there are several different identities that could be at play, such as, I think what's commonly associated with it, which is ethnicity. But think about those other ways. Think about age, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic income levels, nationality, body type. There is so many ways that identities can be have prejudice against. And as you are servicing a people as a whole, those things can be, you can see some things and it can definitely rub you the wrong way, to say the least. All of us, I believe, that are within a professional sort of sphere, and maybe even just all of us collectively, is that we have an oath to do no harm. All right, so we want to make sure that we are helping prevent and alleviate suffering. And if something happens where you have and that then leads you in whatever way in reality create harm. We also have we in the service industry of care, right? We're here because we want to be able to have the optimal care and support constraints, when there are organizational limitations that can compromise your ability to promote well-being, and this can lead to feelings of inadequacy, and ultimately, the thought is possibly moral injury. Respect. Right, that's another one. So when you are witnessing disrespect or mistreatment of the people that you are to care for within the mental health system, that can challenge your commitment to respecting a person's dignity and their autonomy, and that can lead to feelings of betrayal, feelings of guilt as well. So got two more, right? So I'm hoping one of these are really resonating. Trustworthiness, right? So if you are unable to fulfill the promises or the commitments that you make, due to whatever reasons in terms of your limitations. When you make a promise, or sometimes when you have a sense of, my word is my bond, if you've heard that phrase before, and you say that you're going to do something and you look someone in the eye, and sometimes it really happens when it's kids involved, and you say, hey, I'm going to, get this done, or you want your own sense of being able to say that what you say you are going to do is what you do, and there are reasons, and there's always reasons where you can't, and that can compromise your sense of how you feel about your word, and that can lead to feelings of guilt and conflict. The last one is professionalism. As we are, the ones in the room who are servicing on a professional level, that your professional ethics and standards can be affected when you are in a position where you are either per the organization or for your own actions deemed in your perception unprofessional, that can lead to ethical fatigue. So we're going to go into a lot more particulars of these, but I'm going to read them all together, and you pinpoint one that seems to really resonate with you. So I'm going to go back up. So we have compassion, integrity, autonomy, empathy, justice, do no harm, the service industry of care, so service to care, respect, trustworthiness, and professionalism. So one of these, as I say, we all have
Should
more
we be
values.
seeing that on the slide?
No. This is
Oh.
just, I want you to hear it, and I want you not to be, thinking of all of them together collectively, but just picking one and having that hold onto you. Now, the next slide, we can go to that slide. And this is a slide where we're going to take that one that you choose, and we're going to plug it into the ways that this moral injury has been defined, broken up to a segmented section, whatever word that fits you. So for this one, what you see on the chart, let me pull that up so I can look at. So you're going to be at the slide way before. You're going to be the one where it's a square. So go back and then back one more. This one here. Okay. One more over. So the one where it's a chart. Okay, there we go, right there. All right. So, and okay, so for this one, there's different types, right? So we have the act of commission, the act of omission, and betrayal. And I'm going to break down what these are aligned with. So for the act of commission, this is when you do something that you feel like you should have, or when you do something you shouldn't have done. So it's when the act of commission for that leads to moral injury is when you do something, right? And I have an example that's there, and that example is when, let's say, you diagnose inaccurately. So for that one, is that you're in direct participation. You are the perpetrator of the action, right? So remember I said before that it happens when it's a specific event. So this event that happened that caused you the moral injury, it happened because of something that you did. Right. And in this example, and there's many examples, but in this example, it may be that you misrepresented a client's progress to justify their continuation of treatment. So, for whatever, insurance purposes, you knew that this person was doing okay in terms of, whatever would say that the service is likely to continue or not. But because you thought that because they very well so needed extra treatment, you then diagnosed them in a way that was more severe, or the example could work opposite. But whatever it is, it can then, as you go home with yourself, if you have a very strong value of integrity and honesty, this could really shake things up. Right. And then you'll have to sit and with yourself and if it really challenges in a way that hits your identity, then there's going to be some soul searching. And if there's a lot of distress over it, or if there's, the guilt and, your own self-doubt, if you, did the right thing, or, the unethical, even sometimes illegal thing, all of these ways is an example of how moral injury can happen in the respects of an act of commission. Now, the next one is an act of omission. All right, big fancy words, right? And here you have when you don't do something that you should have done, right? So in this example, we have, let's say, don't report a colleague. So let's say if there is, this is a colleague that has unprofessional conduct, unethical behavior, and it contributes to a culture of misconduct. And in this way, there's inaction, there's neglect. It's something that you don't do or you did not do. And because of that, it can then lead to that sense of moral distress inside. So for this one, it would hit the value of professionalism. So if you see yourself within your character as a very professional person, very sort of, upright, let's say if you're within a clinician, right? So you see yourself as a very, a clinical person that is able to have a commitment to your profession as a whole, your ethical guidelines within your the board of psychology. I mean, all of these ways where if you were to not do something, even when we talk about, social justice, like if you had a commitment to a community, or if you had a commitment to a population of people within, when we talk about those areas of diversity, or even if you yourself identify with a particular population. So let's say if your sexuality was one that was in community with others. And so if someone did something, and let's say you didn't speak up, or you didn't speak out, or you didn't intervene, then that can then be, as we're having distinctions of definition, an act of omission, right? All right, and the third one, as we detail through this definition, is betrayal. So what that might look like is that it's something that happens, right? A specific event that's often done by a higher authority. It
Oh
doesn't
my
have to be.
God.
Hmm? Oh, I don't know what that was. That one's often done by a higher authority, but it doesn't have to be, but we often see it as such. And so in the field and profession, and collectively all of the people that are in the room, sometimes it happens like this, where there's an unethical decision that's made. And for this one, let's say, for example, the agency ignores the need of a marginalized community, right? So they got, let's say, a grant, or they got some monies, or they got some resources to give to, a body of people. And for whatever reasons, they don't, right? Or the resources are allocated disproportionately. Well, if you have a strong value of the duty of justice and fairness within the mental health care delivery of services, then that's going to affect you. You're going to, have in your head about what you feel, should be done, what you feel was not done. And there's a sense of disempowerment. There's a sense of lack of agency when it's done for someone that has a higher level of decision-making power than you do. And so that can then also lead to moral injury. So we're really breaking it down to the nuances of the definition within itself. But I think what's important as we learn about moral injury is to recognize in all the different ways that it can be the experience, that it could be exemplified. And so those are the three ways. So the act of commission, the act of omission, and portrayal. All right, so now We've already did the poll, which is really useful because we can pop right into it. I had asked you in poll number 2, what type of moral injury have you encountered? So you can think of examples that were either direct or indirect. And what I want you to remember as you think about this particular part is, what was the one value that you had chosen? And was that value something that you had experienced, or was that value something that was indirect that you had witnessed? And so let's see, I'm going to look at them now. And how interesting, because you all answered the question before we went to the nitty-gritty of the definitions. But what I love about it, that is you answered the questions. What that tells me is that in terms of your knowledge and background of some of the definitions, as well as topics of moral injury, that you all are well versed. So for this one, we got a pretty good, well distribution of the 3 different types. And I'm always really happy to see that some of you have had none like that. I'm happy, because when you look at the prevalence, again, on a global scale, of how this is being experienced, and we're only talking about it now. I'm so glad the conversation is happening now, even though you can imagine that this has been going on for quite a while. So let's move forward with that one. So now, wait, I gotta get this poll out my view. Okay, what does it look like? We've gone through earlier, you've seen where some of these some of the symptoms, how easily it can be paired. So and this would be, let me just make sure you guys are right. All right, so what are the signs? So as what these look like, I want you to be thinking how you see them. So not just the words that you hear, okay, we have some stress and some guilt, but what does that look like in your daily life experiences? What does that look like when you recognize it with yourself? What does that look like when you recognize it in a colleague? Because we might talk intellectually and academically about guilt, but when you see it in front of you, are you able to identify, and are you able to say something about it, or do something about it if it was happening within yourself? So for psychological distress, what we'll see is an emotional disturbance. We'll see intense feelings of guilt and shame and anger, even, because it can look very different in a lot of different ways. And when that moral conflict is happening, again, I want you to look at how anyone can feel it on a certain continuum of degrees of level of intensity. But when you see it at a profound level, when you see it as a very high level, then that's when I saw you pop on. Is that the 5-minute mark? Okay, we're good. That's when you see it at that level. Oh, that went really fast. So with this one, we already went through a lot of the signs, right? So in terms of from work and at home, you carry it at work and at home, and then it does compromise your ethical decision making, and it can lead to work dissatisfaction. And let's see, for the last slide, like 2 more minutes, right? It's what will help. And so for these, we really get into the self-care and reflective practice of mindfulness, and being able to also get peer support. When I talked about you see it in others, being able to look at other people's experience of it, and for that support, and ask them, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do to help? And the most thing that I want to congratulate all of you in terms of even being here is the education and training. So the fact that you are here and that you are looking at, what can I do to be more educated on this? What can I do to be able to have a heightened awareness? This is what is needed. This is how you can help, is being able to be mindful of it all. So that is, I know when we get to questions, we can get into a lot more detail, but I really wanted to get into the nitty gritty of how it is experienced. Um, and so is that my time?
Hi, thank you, doctor. That is wonderful. We're
Okay.
gonna turn it over to Willow, and then we will come back to ask many, many questions that have been coming through the chat and I'm sure it's going to be for both Willow and Dr. Damon. Willow?
Hi there. My name is Willow Burgess Johnson, and I am the program manager for North Carolina Youth and Family Voices Amplified. And I'm also the mother of a teenager with behavioral health challenges. I'm also the recipient of behavioral health services. And I'm also a social worker who has practiced in the public system for almost 2 decades now. And I'm going to share the perspective of individuals and families who are receiving support from our behavioral health system, talk a little bit about the perspective of those who are working in the behavioral health system with lived experience and how moral injury can impact those folks in particular, as well as where we can find some opportunities for repair. We are increasingly living in a world where the demand for support far outstrips the resources that are available to meet that demand. And that really sends messages to people who are seeking support about whether or not the system is responsible when that support is not as supportive as it needs to be, or whether the individual is responsible when the system doesn't provide the support that needs to be there. And that deeply can impact the way that people are able to form trusting relationships with the people that they seek help from. For a lot of people, it takes a lot of courage to reach out for help the first time. It takes a lot of trust, and oftentimes it takes believing that the person that you're reaching out for support from has your best interests at heart. When people in the system are unable to provide effective support, it can really erode that trusting relationship that is the solid foundation and is vital to any supportive and helping relationship. And when people are met with wait lists, when people are met in that initial interaction with large amounts of paperwork, when people are met with staff who are revolving, when you're met with initially meeting one staff and then the next staff person comes on, it can really erode that trust, and it's really difficult to build those trusting relationships. Can we go to the next slide, please? For staff who are working in that kind of environment that is really challenging to feel effective in, what you find is that the efficacy, the sense of self-efficacy is often very, very challenging. Most people, as Dr. Damon said, are in this field because they genuinely want to help people. However, finding themselves in the situation where they are not effective can lead to burnout, can lead to re-traumatization, and can lead to moral injury. And the way that that oftentimes shows up at work is very similar to the way that we see trauma oftentimes showing up at work. So some of the things that we often see are physiological responses for people. So we often see things like stomach aches, headaches, which mean that the staff people are then not showing up at work. They're oftentimes calling out sick. They're not able to be there as much as they might want to be there for the people that they're supporting. We also see folks showing up and being avoidant. They might not be digging in as much as they want or need to actually understand where somebody's coming from. They might not be able to actually really dig in to understand, what are the challenges? Are you actually still facing all of these things that are in your long record from services? Is this still happening for you? When people are actually managing these effects of trauma, sometimes they're just numb, they just tune out, and it can lead to a lack of understanding. It can lead to a lack of empathy. Next slide. One of the things that can be very, very helpful in the way that we are addressing some of the gaps in both capacity and an understanding in the behavioral health field has been to increase the use of the role for folks with lived experience. This also brings some really unique challenges for folks with lived experience in balancing knowing what it feels like from that very deep and visceral place of needing support, and then having to also represent a system that doesn't always have the resources to be able to provide that support. Some of those unique challenges can also manifest as folks sometimes are still in the midst of struggling, in the midst of that lived experience that is bringing them that expertise that helps to know how to support people best. Sometimes they're in the midst of struggling with that. Sometimes the perspective of their role, the values that they bring to the behavioral health world from their lived experience are in conflict with the provider expectations or with the system expectations. And that means that they have to very carefully navigate, and it can put them in some very uncomfortable positions where they're having to to navigate those values very carefully. Having to understand how to set boundaries around when am I going to provide these services. If my provider agency says that services are provided between 8 and 5, but I know that what it's like to be a family and need services, and I'm not available 8 to 5, I still have to work 8 to 5. Sitting in that position can be really, really challenging. And then the other challenge that oftentimes comes up is navigating some of the internalized messages about how, as a culture and a system, we value and prioritize the path of recovery and healing, especially when the system has some very paradoxical and complex setup to it, for things such as not being able to access substance use resources unless you are in active use, and so having to go into relapse to be able to access resources, or having wait lists that are so excessively long for children to be able to access assessments that it actually gets them out of some of the supportive services that may help them to be able to function better in life. Next slide. So how do we actually find some opportunities within this to increase the capacity for, how do we find some opportunities within this to repair? How do we find the opportunity to repair that foundational trusting relationship that most folks in the behavioral health workforce want to be able to bring to be effective in the ways that they are able to provide support in alignment with their moral code, in alignment with the code of ethics, in alignment with their values? One of the resources that most of you should have received is an ebook, Creating a Trauma-Informed System of Care. That's invaluable. Some of the practices that we know about, some of the trauma-informed practices that we know about can be very, very helpful in informing the ways that the system can come in better alignment with some of the values and code of ethics that help us to be responsive to people in the ways that we know are the most supportive to them. Attending to trauma-informed practices, especially around those initial interactions, can be very, very helpful in both communicating messages of efficacy to people who are seeking support, but also in helping folks who are sitting in that support giving position. Providing trauma-informed supervision to support staff to help them be able to reflect on how they are showing up at work can be very, very helpful. To allow folks to not only reflect how they're showing up, but also to understand how they want to be showing up and how they can find some resources and support to be able to show up that way. And then increasing the opportunities to receive feedback from people who have lived experience in accessing supports and services. One of my favorite quotes is from Maya Angelou, that you do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Gathering information from people with lived experience allows us to know better so that we can do better. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over now to Gail.
Hi, I'm going to try to actually put everybody. There we go. Hi, everybody. We have lots and lots and lots of questions. Thank you to Willow and Dr. Damon. I have lots of questions. The first one, and it could be, I think this is for Dr. Damon. That it asks, someone asked, why moral injury is different from PTSD? Can moral injury contribute to PTSD?
Yeah, so I saw that question, and it really is a very good question. So when I originally did this PowerPoint, it was for a 2-hour training for another organization. And I trimmed it to be able to deliver to you all of the things that you needed. But there is quite a lot of information about those distinctions. And so simply put, I would say yes, that yes, they can both happen. Yes, one can lead into them. Yes, one can happen, another can't happen. I mean, it's all a mixture. But what I want you to know is that of those distinctions, remember in the beginning when I said that one is the profound sense of distress, and within that distress is an existential crisis, is a questioning of your own identity. That's what is particular about moral injury. Where when you look at, and remember that it's also not a diagnosis. When you look at PTSD, that is a clinical diagnosis, which when you talk about that, it's really about looking at the symptoms, intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, hypervigilance, avoidance. When you have these mood disturbances that happen because of the traumatic event, how they pair with each other is that they're both linked to a specific event. Something happened. Where, right, if you think of burnout is not something specific. Burnout is really when you're on the job and it's just ongoing distress and frustration. All of them look so similar. That's why the research is trying to catch up with this stuff. So what you're cluing into is particularly on point. So when you go into a situation, if you're seeing someone exhibiting the symptoms that would be PTSD is diagnosable, they're in to get care, then that's that. Now, having PTSD can then lead to a profound sense of questioning themselves, which is now moral injury. So now you have them both compounded. So I'm hoping that I answered your question sort of short, but there's a lot of conversation to these distinctions, just so you know.
Thank you. The next question actually is to Willow. And someone asked how do you support a family peer specialist when they're feeling like they're experiencing moral injury as they are supporting a family who is also experiencing moral injury?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of that has to do with being able to, um, uh, one, identify what's going on, and then two, being able to um, increase the level of support there and being able to name what's going on. So being able to recognize, name what's going on, and also name what's in your control and what's not in your control, so that you can really identify kind of where some of that distress is coming from, and where you can align, where you can connect. Connection is so deeply helpful and useful, and going back to that trusting and supportive relationship, and really being able to find that connection, so that when you recognize that moral injury happens, that you are not feeling like you are alone in that space of distress, and being able to name it, connect around it, and then being able to move forward from there.
And Willow, I don't know if you've experienced this before, but when I have supervised family peer specialists for many, many years, and I know I have some family peer specialists that really feel defeated when they're trying to get the families they're supporting to get therapy or to get even food stamps or whatever they need, and they're put on waiting lists and they're not given those services that they know are out there that exist, but they can't find them in the community that they're supporting, that there's a lot of stress and tension. Do you find that?
Absolutely. I think there's a huge disconnect. And I think one of the things that is often very helpful with that is to recognize that it is not, is to be very careful with our language about how much that responsibility for that lack of resources is placed on the families who are struggling to find those resources, and recognizing that it is, yes, helpful to provide support to help families to navigate our less than perfect systems, but to also recognize that the systems themselves need feedback about how they need to adjust to be able to meet the need that is there. And that it is a bit of a band-aid, to say that we need to help folks to navigate those systems. It is also a solution to, at the same time, give feedback to those systems about how the system can evolve.
Thank you. And I think this could be for either of you, but Charlize says moral injury when it's HR, when the HR is biased. So I'm sure a lot of it comes down to human resources, if that's what you mean, Charlize. Um, the following question. How about at work when you must promote ideas and concepts that are opposite to what you feel your moral values are? You're on mute, doctor.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. So yeah, that one definitely happens. And, as I mentioned, there are quite a few different disciplines and professions and types of people that do get affected by moral injury in a lot of different ways. But, when, HR people, they come in with their own set of, like their own moral values, their own values when the character in their profession in terms of being able to offer um, job opportunity to different types of people, and being able, because of their expertise, to see the type of job professional that will fit the job. And so when there are, whatever, organizational constraints that come down that say, oh, now you have to hire this many types of people, or you have to hire this person because they're the brother or family member of this other, or even just a transfer from another organization, and that there's someone in particular that will service the people that you work with better or more. Yeah, that can really sort of question, well, why am I here? Why am I doing this job? How am I being able to offer my expertise and the reason why I got hired. And so those are all things, when you think about moral injury, the example that I used from the beginning is really extreme about, someone taking a life, but sometimes it happens on a smaller scale in terms of the situation itself. But that doesn't mean that the impact that it has in your life or the impact that it has in your sense of self doesn't have that same sense of distress. It's a continuum, and it's different
Yeah.
for every single person.
Kevin has a great question. How do we coach up to our leaders about building awareness around moral injury? That's a great one.
So there's like a lot of literature out there that is particular and specific to organizations. And it's really good stuff that I think that once it becomes, and this is unfortunate when it comes to large organizations, once it becomes a big enough problem, then people start to pay attention and do something about it. So on an organizational structure, what you can do is you can have within the daily activities of the organization peer support groups. You can have put into the clinical supervision of the mental health professionals a peer group that actually has a training on how to deal with moral injurious events. So if we as a profession within the mental health profession are all knowing that this is highly probable, and if even in the small list that I gave of the moral values, we all know what might be targeted, then we can presumably come up with a discussion, with the training, with the support group. We can come up with something that actually starts to build the resiliency of the people that are in this situation before they become in the situation. So at that way, they not only build up their self-care practices, but they build up their resiliency to reduce the vulnerability of moral injury. It increases the awareness of the staffing of the group to be able to see the person that has moral injury and intervene faster. So all of these elements are something that as an organization, as a supervisor, a manager, at whatever degrees of the organizational structure can do to help the people that helps the people that we help. So
Thank you. A really follow-up question on that. And Willow, if you could speak to best practice in supervising, I'd love it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about that as well, just in terms of kind of addressing leadership. I think that there are a number of really good codes of ethics out there, and a lot of folks, a lot of organizations that have recently updated codes of ethics, and particularly as we are adding in new fields and new roles in the behavioral health field, looking at with codes of ethics, how do your policy and any agency policies and procedures align with codes of ethics. So particularly as we're bringing in folks with lived experience, how do those align? And so as Gail was pointing out, things like our folks with lived experience being supervised by folks with lived experience, so that we are bringing in that perspective into that supervision so that folks are getting the support that they need to know how to navigate some of those potential situations that can come up that can put them in those situations where they have the potential to face a moral injury. Do they know how, does the agency know what kinds of situations that we are asking peers, family peer support specialists, youth peers to face that could put them in a position where they might either be having to act or having to make a decision not to act in a way that might go against either the code of ethics that they are being asked to follow, or their own value system. And so really ensuring that leadership is aware of not only the own role code of ethics, but the code of ethics for every role in the organization.
yeah.
Yes, and we do know that best practice is to be for family peers and for all peers to be supervised by people with lived experience and peers. So that, thank you, Willow. And that also brings up, I know a lot of questions are in the chat about ethics. The office hours for NASDAQ next month will be all about ethics. And then in June, we'll be talking about peer drift, which actually does come into play with moral injury. If you're not feeling comfortable and you feel injured, deeply injured, how you drift away from your original role as a peer if you don't feel appreciated and worthy and able to do your job effectively. So thank you, Willow. We have lots and lots of questions coming up. Does anyone want to just ask a question and take their mics off? I have to kind of backtrack here. So if you have a question to ask out loud, please do.
I'm gonna take a moment to be kind of brave here because I work for SAMHSA, so I'll just say that, and I am a family member, so I'm looking at it from that perspective as well. But I've worked at a high level of policy work for many years, and I'm also an expert in disaster work. And I've been in many disaster responses at a very large scale. And I know that moral injury often occurs when people are involved with making very high level decisions and really sometimes are aware of things that they know are they could have macro effects. And there's a lot of dynamics that can occur in that. And I'll just say that in my own reflecting on this, one of the things I found that was really important to stay healthy is to be clear on if something was coming up that was going to cause me to feel that I have to dissociate in some really deep way, that's going to be a trigger to some really deep mental health concerns for me. And that's when I'm going to have to say, I can't do that or take a stand. It's more like kind of having an inner compass to know how it feels to be well. And when I start to feel like I'm going to have to really deeply disassociate because it goes against some sort of moral, deep concern. And there are many things I have to navigate that don't fit that criteria, but I mean, that are not easy, right? But if it's going to cause me to dissociate in some way, then I have to either step away or take, an appropriate stand on it to keep my own wellness in order to stay in my career. And again, that's not everyday stuff, but I wanted to emphasize that because I think if we over adapt to moral injury moments, it can lead to people who are leaders who are maybe very dissociated because they've over adapted over time. And that would be a very big concern. You may want to speak to that. I just made a statement.
Yeah.
And I know it's being recorded, so I'm being brave. I'm not speaking to my workplace right now, but I'm speaking to wisdom that I've gained over decades, and including being a lived experience expert in spaces where I work.
Maggie, we appreciate that. And thank you for being brave. That was quite helpful.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were done.
I just want to say that, Marianne, we see your hand. You're next, but do we have a response for Maggie?
I would love to speak to that because what you're speaking of is syndrome, right? There's also what is it? Post-traumatic growth. And I think that what happens when you're defining your own sense of character and moral values, it happens over time. It happens over a lifetime. It happens over life experiences. And so sometimes when this happens, if you've ever heard, I'm a trauma specialist. So a lot of times in trauma, they'll say, trauma doesn't have to be traumatic. And so it does happen when something will come up. It does happen when it will sort of affect you at your core. It does happen when you can have existential questioning. But what it can lead to is a further definition of where you stand. What it can lead to is the confidence and the resiliency and the courage to speak up when you realize that piece of you or that part of yourself has been challenged. And so when this does happen, I put in the chat a lot of resources in self-care. There's a lot more out there. But when you have a sense of mindfulness and self-awareness, where you do know where you stand and you do know what you believe in, you'll be able to identify quickly what is getting targeted and then what is getting affected. And then you're able to, with support, either with the professional, with friends, with family, or even even in your own reflection, then you're able to sit with it and be able to digest it and get through it and feel your emotions by, and then come out of it feeling like, hey, I know what's up, and I know what I want to say, and I know what I believe, and I know what is getting affected. And that's a really empowering place to be, because this more injurious event happened. So sometimes it can be a growth experience, and I love that you put that in.
Thank you. Mary Ann?
Yes, hi. I just want to thank you for this presentation. And while I do not work in the mental health field, I actually work in the disability field, and the role that we play is to provide supports and services to families, supporting family members with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And resources, as all of you have already identified, are often scarce, and there are long waiting lists. And I'm also a parent of a wonderful adult woman who has multiple disabilities. So and I'm sure it's not lost on anybody here that this doesn't just speak to the mental health field. It cuts across all sectors, and I'm just so excited by this, and I feel like I've experienced some healing here today just for myself, and I can see for those folks who are on the front line receiving calls, receiving requests, how this is injurious to them, how they might experience. But then I also, being a family member, I know what it's like to be on that side of it and in desperate need of support and services. And so all of that is to say thank you. And I want to take this back, and I'm hoping that we have an opportunity to bring this to our larger group here. I think it would serve us all well. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Mary Ann. And this is a growing topic and one of great concern these days. So I'm glad we're able to bring it to you at the moment. Any other questions? This is your time. You can take your mic off and ask. Fran, I saw something coming up from you. Do you want to speak upon it? Okay. Well, if we could pull up the slides, we will do our closing. The PowerPoints in this recording will definitely be available. Not only will you get a follow-up email with that information, it will also be posted on our website. So, like our slide says, a link to recording of today's presentation, today's slides, and all the upcoming events you'll be getting. Please, next slide, please. Next coming event is very interesting. We're going to welcome the father, existential risk of fathers, inclusive practices. We have a great group of men going to talk about fatherhood in the month of April. And also, again, I wanted to bring back and remind everybody that our office hours will be focused on professional ethics in the month of April, and also in the month of June, there will be peer drift. So I think those two really match well with moral injury. SAMHSA, we're also very proud to be presenting a joint presentation with the National Federation of Families and NAMI and Disability Rights Center. We'll all be collaborating on some upcoming trainings. You can stay tuned for registration links. Next slide. And of course, the part that you've heard if you've come to these presentations before, and at the beginning of every welcome, I ask you, we really need your feedback and for you to fill out the surveys. It fulfills our SAMHSA responsibility, and it also tells us what we can do better or what you enjoyed. So if you can follow the link, it's posted here. There's the QR code, or if you exit the Zoom on your own, you will be taken to the survey and you can fill out that form. And once you do, you'll get your certificate of attendance. Thank you so much for joining us today, and you get a minutes back, about 14 or 13 minutes back in your day. So that's always appreciated. Thank you so much for coming. And Fran, love to see you here. I'm sorry I couldn't
Hey,
hear from you.
hey, can you put the um survey back on?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. And what I was gonna say, this is Fran Purdy, is that we've got to be able to get past doing just one-to-one direct service work. We've got to keep feeding ourselves by recognizing the moral injury and then being able to stay community focused and changing this system that promotes moral injury. That's what I was trying to get to. Thank you.
Well, those are great words. Thank you, Fran. And Tabitha, my email is at the end of this. And also, when you get your follow-up email, my email will be in there. Thank you, everybody.